The late afternoon sun spilled through the tall glass windows of Denver International Airport, turning the polished floors into mirrors of golden light. People hurried in every direction, dragging suitcases, clutching coffees, calling out to children who strayed too far ahead. For most, it was just another day of travel, another routine flight connecting one place to another. For Emily Dawson, sitting quietly in the terminal with a leather satchel on her lap, it was something slightly different. Travel still stirred something inside her, something restless. Even now, years after leaving the Air Force, the sound of jet engines rumbling across the tarmac had a way of tugging at her memories. She'd told herself this trip was nothing unusual, a simple flight home after a week spent speaking at a small aviation conference. But deep down, every journey by air carried echoes of her past life. Her boarding pass read row 11, seat C, middle of the cabin, middle seat, no luxury attached. She didn't mind. Emily had never cared much for first-class frills or aisle privileges. What mattered was efficiency, control, and getting from one point to another in one piece. It was how she had been trained to think, and it had never left her. The loudspeaker crackled with the boarding announcement for Flight 327 to Chicago. People began forming lines, parents wrangling toddlers, business travelers impatiently checking phones, retirees chatting about vacation plans. Emily rose smoothly, joining the flow. At 41, she carried herself with an understated confidence. Her frame was lean, her movements measured, her posture impossibly straight. To most eyes, she was just another woman traveling alone, perhaps a teacher, a consultant, maybe a manager from some firm. Very few would have guessed she had once flown F-16s in combat zones thousands of miles from home. The jet bridge smelled, faintly of fuel and rubber, a scent that struck her sharper than most others might notice. It wasn't unpleasant to her, quite the opposite. It reminded her of flight lines at dawn, when the air was cool and engines were warming for the day's first sorties. She took a long breath as she stepped onto the aircraft. The cabin was alive with the shuffle of passengers stowing bags, bumping elbows, muttering apologies. Flight attendants greeted each person with professional smiles that thinned as the stress of boarding mounted. Emily offered a polite nod as she moved toward row 11. She slipped her satchel into the overhead bin, then lowered herself into the middle seat with the same care she had once used when strapping into a cockpit. To her right, by the window, sat an older man with a baseball cap pulled low, headphones already snug around his ears. He barely glanced at her before turning back to his music. To her left, an exhausted mother tried to soothe her restless son, who kicked rhythmically against the seat in front of him. Emily offered the woman a gentle smile, and for a moment, their eyes met with silent solidarity. We'll get through this flight together. Once settled, Emily allowed her gaze to wander. She always observed. It was a habit drilled into her from years of training. Know your surroundings. Recognize details others might overlook. Read a room, or in this case, a cabin. She noticed the young couple across the aisle, arguing over who got the aisle seat. The businessman scrolling through slides on a glowing laptop. The teenager behind her furiously texting until the last possible moment before takeoff. Each person seemed consumed by their own small world, unaware of how fragile the larger one above the clouds could be. As the cabin filled, Emily's thoughts drifted back to her years in uniform. She had flown combat missions over rugged terrain, missions where every decision carried consequences measured in lives. She remembered the adrenaline of the afterburner roaring behind her, the vibrations coursing through her body, the precision required to control speed, altitude, weapon systems all at once. In those moments, she was more alive than she had ever felt. Yet it was also exhausting, unforgiving, and relentless. After 2 decades of service, she had stepped away, trading military skies for civilian airfields. She now trained the next generation of pilots, guiding eager cadets through their first clumsy mistakes, their first triumphs. It was rewarding, though never the same. Her fingers traced the armrest absent-mindedly as she listened to the cabin crew run through safety checks. She had heard these words countless times, but her mind automatically replayed them through the lens of operational safety. She didn't just hear the instructions, she analyzed. She visualized where the nearest exits were, the structural layout of the aircraft, the emergency protocols she had learned long ago. It wasn't paranoia. It was reflex. A tall man in a business suit squeezed past, bumping her shoulder as he wrestled his carry-on into the overhead bin. Emily shifted without complaint. In the cockpit, she had dealt with turbulence, hostile fire, and instrument failures. A cramped seatmate wasn't something worth losing patience over. Finally, the cabin doors closed with a heavy click. Flight attendants walked briskly, performing final checks, voices firm but calm. The hum of the engines deepened, vibrating faintly through the floor. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Commercial jets lacked the raw ferocity of fighters, but still, the resonance stirred something deep inside. The sound was a heartbeat she recognized. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, a child squealed with delight. The businessman beside her muttered into his phone one last time before reluctantly powering it down. The boy in the next row drummed impatient fingers against the tray table, earning a scolding from his mother. Emily folded her hands neatly in her lap and focused on the subtle shifts in motion, the lurch of the tug disengaging, the taxi toward the runway, the faint squeal of rubber against concrete. Through the small oval window beside her row, the horizon tilted as the plane made its turn. Out on the runway, aircraft lined up like patient beasts, engines spooling with power. Emily imagined the control tower orchestrating it all, voices guiding dozens of tons of metal into synchronized choreography. It was a dance she had always admired. When Flight 327 paused, waiting its turn for takeoff, Emily's pulse quickened unconsciously. She could almost anticipate the pilot's hand movements, the throttle easing forward. The instruments checked, the brief moment of stillness before release. She pictured the nose lifting, the wheels leaving Earth, the sudden weightlessness. And when it happened, when the engines surged and the cabin pressed them back against their seats, Emily couldn't help but smile faintly. Some passengers gasped or gripped their armrests, but for her, takeoff was pure familiarity, a rhythm she had lived 1,000 times. The city lights fell away as the plane climbed into the orange-tinged sky. Clouds swallowed them, then released them into clearer air above. The world below shrank into toy roads and miniature rivers. Emily allowed herself to breathe deeply, settling into the quiet anticipation of flight. She had expected nothing more than a simple journey home, a few hours to herself. Her plan was to land, grab a late dinner, and return to her small house, waiting in the suburbs. She believed this flight would be unremarkable, another routine chapter in her post-military life. Yet deep inside, there was always an edge. Years in combat had taught her that calm skies could darken in seconds, that what seemed ordinary could shift without warning. And though she didn't know it yet, her instincts were right. For now, however, Emily Dawson was just another passenger. In row 11, anonymous among strangers, waiting for the flight ahead. The aircraft climbed smoothly into the sky, engines humming with steady assurance as the runway shrank far beneath them. For most passengers on Flight 327, the hardest part, the roaring takeoff, was already behind them. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, followed by the captain's calm voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our initial cruising altitude. Please remain seated as the seatbelt sign is still on. We'll let you know when it's safe to move about the cabin. A ripple of relief passed through the passengers. Conversations began again. Laughter mingled with the rustle of snack wrappers, and the cabin settled into its mid-flight rhythm. Emily Dawson sat in row 11, hands folded neatly in her lap, gazing through the small oval window as cotton-like clouds drifted past. From 30,000 feet, the world below was muted, almost peaceful. Rivers glistened like silver threads, fields stretched like patchwork quilts, and highways cut thin lines across the earth. The businessman beside her, impatient since boarding, pulled out his laptop the moment the seatbelt sign blinked off. His fingers clicked furiously across the keys as he muttered numbers under his breath. The tired mother on her other side had managed to coax her son into playing quietly with a handheld game console, though his legs still twitched restlessly against the seat. Emily gave the boy a small smile when he peeked at her, and for a moment his mischievous energy softened. A flight attendant passed by, expertly balancing a tray of drinks as the beverage cart followed slowly behind. Her smile was automatic, but kind, her tone rehearsed yet warm. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked Emily. "Just water, thank you," Emily replied with a nod. Years of military discipline had made her cautious about hydration during flights. Coffee or alcohol never tempted her, not when she knew how altitude could affect the body. The clink of ice in plastic cups and the hiss of soda cans being opened filled the cabin like a soft symphony of ordinary life. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mingling with the faint scent of disinfectant and the recycled oxygen that carried whispers of every passenger's breath. For most people on board, this was the stage of the flight where nerves eased and boredom began. Some settled into movies on the seatback screens, others curled into blankets, headphones muffling the world. Emily, however, never allowed herself complete detachment. Though she looked calm, her mind remained sharp, attentive to the subtleties others overlooked. She noticed the way the aircraft banked gently to adjust its course, the brief flicker of a warning light above the galley that a flight attendant quickly silenced, the subtle shift in engine pitch as the pilots managed throttle. To anyone else, these details were invisible. To her, they painted a moving portrait of the plane's performance. It wasn't paranoia. It was habit, one she couldn't switch off. Leaning her head slightly against the headrest, she let her thoughts wander. She remembered her last deployment, years earlier, when she had sat in the cockpit of an F-16, watching dawn break over desert terrain. The silence before missions had always been deceptive, a fragile stillness that could shatter in seconds. She thought of her wingmen, the camaraderie they shared, the trust that bound them together. She thought of the radio chatter, the clipped codes, the exhilaration of controlling a machine that responded like an extension of her own body. Those days felt both close enough to touch and distant enough to belong to another lifetime. Now, sitting between a stranger's elbow and a child's restless kicks, she was simply Emily Dawson, civilian, anonymous. Yet she carried all of those years inside her, folded carefully like a secret uniform no one else could see. Across the aisle, the young couple who had argued earlier had settled into silence. The woman leaned against her partner's shoulder, scrolling lazily through her phone, while the man flipped through a sports magazine. 2 rows ahead, a teenager laughed loudly at a comedy on his screen, drawing a few annoyed glances. The older man by the window beside Emily tapped his foot in rhythm to his music, lost in his own world. Everything about the flight felt ordinary. Predictably, comfortably ordinary. And yet Emily knew better than most that ordinary could vanish without warning. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers unbuckled with the universal relief of people eager to stretch legs. The aisle filled with movement, some heading to the lavatories, others rummaging in overhead bins. Flight attendants maneuvered, their carts with practiced precision, offering tiny bottles of wine and miniature bags of pretzels. The mother beside Emily gratefully accepted a ginger ale, while her son devoured a pack of cookies with sticky enthusiasm. Emily opened the in-flight magazine tucked into the seat pocket, though she barely glanced at its glossy pages. The articles on weekend getaways and shopping destinations seemed hollow, a far cry from the kind of journeys she once took. She closed it after a few minutes and returned to watching the clouds. For a while, time seemed suspended. The aircraft was a capsule of life hurtling across the sky, holding hundreds of people who trusted blindly in its safety. The hum of the engines was steady, the vibrations smooth. Conversations rose and fell, the soundtrack of humanity in transit. Emily allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps this flight truly would be as uneventful as she had hoped. She thought of landing later that evening, of stepping into the quiet comfort of her home, of greeting her dog who would wag with uncontainable joy. She thought of maybe calling her former squadron mate who had been pestering her to meet for dinner. Simple things, civilian things. Life after war was built from them. But then, as she shifted in her seat, she caught a brief flicker of unease in her chest. It was irrational, she told herself. Nothing was wrong. The flight was smooth, the crew competent, the passengers calm. Still, a part of her, the part that had once survived hostile skies, felt the faintest tug of instinct. A whisper that reminded her peace was fragile. She pushed the thought aside, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Old habits. They never truly disappeared. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the cabin in soft orange light. Shadows stretched across faces, creating a quiet intimacy. Among strangers who shared the same temporary home in the sky, laughter drifted from the back rows, where a group of college students played cards on their tray tables. The tired mother beside Emily finally leaned back, her son asleep at last. The businessman continued typing, though his eyes were bleary now, his tie loosened. It was, by every measure, a perfectly ordinary departure. Smooth, safe, unremarkable. And yet, for Emily Dawson, combat pilot, turned civilian passenger, the ordinariness carried weight. She knew it was a thin veneer, a fragile calm that could shatter with a single misstep. For now, though, she let it be enough. She closed her eyes briefly, letting herself drift into the rhythm of flight, unaware that the moment she had always trained for was drawing closer with every passing mile. The cabin of Flight 327 had settled into a comfortable rhythm, a floating world of half-sleep and casual conversation. Overhead lights glowed faintly as dusk deepened outside the windows, casting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and gray. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisles, collecting empty cups and discarded wrappers. Laughter from the college students in the back row rose above the hum of engines, while the steady clack of the businessman's keyboard beside Emily marked time like a metronome. Everything seemed ordinary. Then came the jolt. At first, it was subtle, a tremor that rattled through the floorboards like a passing shiver. Passengers barely noticed, most assuming it was turbulence. Emily's eyes flicked toward the overhead bins, where bags quivered against their latches. Her trained senses immediately sharpened. That wasn't turbulence. It was different, short, sharp, mechanical. The second tremor left no doubt. A violent shudder rocked the cabin, knocking drinks from tray tables. Gasps erupted as the plane dipped abruptly, then steadied. The boy beside Emily clutched his mother's arm, wide-eyed and terrified. The businessman cursed under his breath, slamming his laptop shut as it slid dangerously close to the floor. Then the sound came. A deafening bang split the air, reverberating through the fuselage. It wasn't the muted thud of turbulence or the whine of air pressure. It was metallic, explosive, gut-wrenching. The left side of the plane shuddered violently, followed by a grinding roar that drowned every other noise. Oxygen masks tumbled from overhead compartments, dangling like pale ghosts. The cabin lights flickered. Screams erupted. Emily's pulse spiked, but her mind was calm, calculating. Her body moved before her thoughts fully formed. She pulled the mask toward her, securing it with practiced efficiency. She checked the mother and child beside her, tugging the strap over the boy's head when the mother's shaking hands fumbled. The businessman fought to put his arm backward until Emily steadied it for him. Around them, chaos spread. A woman 2 rows back sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her mask with trembling hands. An elderly man across the aisle clawed at his chest, panicked by the sudden rush of oxygen. Passengers shouted questions no one could answer. The flight attendants' voices cracked as they shouted over the din, urging everyone to remain calm. But calm was impossible. The aircraft continued to vibrate with unsettling irregularity. Emily could feel it through the floor, a rhythm that told her more than the captain's silence. This was no mild failure. Something in the engine, or worse, the systems controlling it, had gone catastrophically wrong. She leaned slightly toward the window, though the older man in the seat beside her already had his face pressed to the glass. Flames licked from the left engine, tiny bursts of orange against the fading sky. Smoke trailed behind, curling into the slipstream like a black ribbon unraveling. Emily's stomach tightened. The worst-case scenarios she had drilled into cadets now stared her in the face. A single-engine failure was survivable, but this looked unstable, unpredictable. The intercom crackled. For a moment, static filled the cabin. Then the captain's voice broke through, clipped and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've experienced a serious malfunction with our left engine. The crew is assessing the situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and oxygen masks secured." His voice faltered, just for a second. Most passengers missed it, too consumed by their own fear. Emily didn't miss it. That hesitation was enough. The situation was worse than he was letting on. The plane lurched again, dropping several feet in an instant. Passengers shrieked as stomachs flipped and belongings rattled free from overhead. Bins. A suitcase burst from its latch, crashing into the aisle, narrowly missing a flight attendant who scrambled to her feet with wide, terrified eyes. Emily gripped the armrests, grounding herself in the chaos. She forced her breathing to stay steady, counting the seconds between each violent tremor. Her mind worked rapidly, reconstructing possibilities. Hydraulic failure? Compressor stall? Fire spreading beyond containment? The symptoms pointed to cascading issues, problems feeding problems. Beside her, the boy whimpered, clinging to his mother. Emily leaned down, her voice low but firm. "It's okay. Keep your mask on. Breathe slowly. You're safe." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The boy's wide eyes locked on hers, and for a moment his trembling stilled. His mother exhaled shakily, gripping Emily's hand in silent gratitude. A shrill alarm bleated faintly from the cockpit, muffled by the closed door, yet unmistakable to Emily's trained ear. Warnings, multiple. She recognized the cadence of crisis alarms, the relentless chime that meant systems were deteriorating faster than they could be managed. The cabin lights dimmed suddenly, then flared back on. Gasps rippled again. Somewhere behind her, a man shouted angrily, demanding to know what was happening. His voice carried raw fear disguised as outrage. A flight attendant tried to calm him, her own voice trembling. Emily's own fear was there, but buried beneath layers of instinct and discipline. She knew panic was useless. Action, control, preparation, those were the weapons against fear. But here, in row 11, she was just a passenger. She wasn't in the cockpit. She wasn't at the controls. The helplessness gnawed at her. Another metallic groan rattled the airframe. The wing flexed unnaturally, visible even from her row. The smell of burning fuel seeped into the cabin, acrid and unmistakable. Passengers coughed against their masks. The captain's voice returned, sharper this time. "Cabin crew, prepare for possible emergency procedures." The words hit like a hammer. Passengers erupted into fresh cries. The phrase wasn't casual, it was deliberate, part of the language of aviation emergencies. Emily sat straighter, her heartbeat quickening. This was escalating faster than most on board could comprehend. She looked toward the cockpit door, her jaw tightening. She needed to be in there, to see the instruments, to evaluate the failure firsthand. But she stayed seated, forcing herself to wait. She couldn't simply storm forward. Not yet. Around her, humanity spilled raw and unfiltered. Prayers whispered in trembling voices. Hands clasped too tightly. Tears streaming unchecked. The illusion of safety had shattered, and the reality of fragility pressed in from every side. For Emily, though, this was more than fear. It was recognition. She had been here before, in different skies, in different aircraft. She had seen machines fail, missions collapse, lives hang by threads. And she had survived, not because she was unafraid, but because she had learned to master the fear. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cockpit door, waiting. She didn't know what would happen next, but some part of her, deep inside, already suspected the call was coming. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, charged with a tension that no amount of oxygen masks could relieve. The acrid smell of burning fuel lingered faintly, mixing with the recycled air, searing into the nostrils of every passenger. Conversations had dwindled into murmurs and prayers. A few passengers sobbed openly, their fear uncontained. Others sat rigid, masks strapped tightly, eyes wide with the silent terror of people suddenly confronted with their own mortality. Emily Dawson remained still in her seat in row 11, every sense tuned. She listened not just to the passengers, but to the subtle orchestra of the machine itself, the uneven hum of the surviving engine, the faint whine of hydraulics straining, the occasional metallic groan as the airframe protested against the forces ripping through it. She didn't need to see the cockpit instruments to know what they displayed. Her instincts filled the gaps with painful accuracy. Then the intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, taut with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain." His pause was too long. Everyone felt it. His voice carried a weight it hadn't before, stripped of reassurance. "We've lost full function in one of our engines, and our systems are unstable. We're working with air traffic control to establish an emergency landing. In the meantime," the pause again. Every passenger froze, straining to hear. "If there are any licensed pilots on board, particularly those with combat flight experience, please make yourselves known immediately." The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. For a moment, silence reigned. Even the crying stopped. The absurdity of the request stunned everyone into stillness. Passengers looked around in disbelief, eyes darting up and down the rows as if expecting someone to stand up right away. Murmurs rippled, growing louder. "Did he just say combat pilots?" Someone whispered. "Are you kidding me?" Another muttered, half in panic, half in denial. Emily's stomach tightened. A call she had been waiting for, dreading, in a way had come. Her heart thudded in her chest, faster than she wanted to admit. The businessman beside her pulled off his mask just long enough to bark at no one in particular. "That can't be real. The captain's supposed to fly the plane, not us. They're not serious, right?" He shook his head, eyes wild, as though trying to laugh off the absurdity. But Emily knew. The captain wouldn't have asked, unless the situation had slipped beyond the manageable. Civilian pilots could assist in communication or navigation. Combat pilots, however, were trained for survival and chaos-trained to improvise under catastrophic failure, to adapt when machines broke and enemies closed in. Her hands gripped the armrests, knuckles pale. She had promised herself her combat days were behind her. She had promised to live quietly, to let the younger generation shoulder the burden. But here, in row 11, that promise dissolved like smoke. Passengers were staring at one another, waiting for someone, anyone, to rise. "There's got to be somebody," a woman said desperately. "Someone has to be a pilot." But no one moved. A man in the back half rose, only to shake his head and sit back down muttering, "I've only flown Cessnas." The tension rose with every second of inaction. Emily's thoughts raced. She remembered her first combat sortie, the tremor in her hands before gripping the stick, the way fear melted into focus once she was airborne. She remembered the split-second decisions, the alarm screaming, the knowledge that hesitation meant death. She remembered surviving, not because she was fearless, but because she had acted. Her breathing steadied. The choice was no longer about her. It was about the mother beside her, clutching her sleeping son. It was about the college students laughing minutes ago, now holding hands with white-knuckled fear. It was about the dozens of strangers whose lives balanced on a knife's edge. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuckled her seatbelt. The faint metallic click of the latch was louder in her ears than the roar of the engines. The businessman snapped, his head toward her, disbelief etched on his face. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply. "I'm answering the call," Emily said evenly, her voice low but unshakable. She stood, and the entire row seemed to shift with her movement. Passengers turned to watch, as though sensing that the moment of deliverance, or doom, was unfolding. In front of them, whispers surged. "Is she? Did she say she's a pilot? Thank God." The nearest flight attendant froze at the sight of Emily rising. For a second, she looked ready to order her back into her seat. But then Emily met her eyes with a gaze that was steady, commanding, unmistakable. It was the look of someone who had worn command before, who had sat in cockpits where every decision meant life or death. "I'm a former Air Force combat pilot," Emily said clearly, projecting her voice so that not only the attendant but nearby passengers could hear. The words rolled through the cabin like a lifeline thrown into deep water. Relief lit up the attendant's face. She didn't hesitate. "Come with me," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and gratitude. She pressed the intercom button. On her handheld radio, "Captain, we have someone." The businessman gawked, shaking his head in disbelief. The mother beside Emily covered her mouth with one hand, tears pooling in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." The boy, now fully awake, watched Emily with a look of awe, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. As Emily stepped into the aisle, passengers parted instinctively, their eyes following her every move. She felt the weight of those stares, the desperate hope placed upon her shoulders. She didn't falter. Her stride was steady, purposeful, the stride of someone who had walked toward danger before. The cabin fell into a hushed reverence as she made her way forward. For the first time since the engine had exploded, silence spread not from shock or panic, but from fragile hope. When she reached the cockpit door, the attendant rapped sharply, giving the clearance code. The door opened, just a fraction, then wider, revealing the dimly lit sanctuary of instruments, warning lights, and the harried faces of the flight crew. Emily paused on the threshold, taking a breath. Behind her sat a cabin full of strangers, their fates tangled with hers. Ahead lay the battlefields she thought she had left behind. She stepped inside. The door to the cockpit closed behind Emily with a heavy click, sealing her away from the chaos of the cabin. For a moment, the sounds of panicked passengers dimmed, replaced by a different cacophony. The shrill wail of alarms, the insistent beeping of warning lights, the clipped voices of the flight crew as they wrestled with controls. The cockpit was dim, bathed in the glow of glowing instruments, half of them flashing amber or red. The air was hot, thick with tension, and carried a faint metallic tang from overheated systems. Emily's eyes swept across the panels in a heartbeat, absorbing the scene with the practiced speed of someone who had lived in such spaces for most of her adult life. The captain glanced up, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked older than she expected, gray streaks at his temples, his eyes frantic but not broken. The first officer beside him worked feverishly, flipping switches, reading data aloud, his voice shaking. Engine 2 fire indicator still on. Hydraulic pressure unstable. Aileron response is sluggish. Autopilot disengaged. Emily stepped forward. Emily Dawson, former Air Force combat pilot. I was in row 11. Tell me what you've got. The captain blinked, momentarily stunned by the sudden authority in her voice. But something in her tone, calm and commanding, cut through his hesitation. He gestured her closer, nodding quickly. Left engines gone. Fire suppression triggered, but warnings still flashing. We're losing hydraulics on the left side. Controls are sluggish. We've declared an emergency. But, he faltered, swallowing hard. It's unstable. I don't know how much time we have. Emily slid into the jump seat behind them, strapping in with swift precision. Her hands itched to touch the controls, but she resisted for now. Instead, she scanned the instrument panel, her combat-honed brain sorting through the mess of data. She spoke evenly, almost clinical. Okay, one engine down. Fire indicator won't. Clear. Hydraulic loss explains the sluggish control. Autopilot's useless, so manual all the way in. What's your nearest diversion? Lincoln Regional, the first officer replied instantly, his voice cracking. Runway length is tight, but it's closest. Chicago's too far on one engine with this damage. Emily nodded. Lincoln will have to do. Get a TC to clear us priority. We'll need emergency services waiting. The captain gave her a sharp look. You've done this before? Her eyes locked on his, steady, unflinching. More times than I can count. Different aircraft, different skies. But the rules don't change. Something shifted in his gaze. Relief. Trust. He gave a small nod, then turned back to his controls with renewed focus. The alarm screamed again, a fresh warning flashing across the display. The first officer swore. Hydraulic fluid pressure dropping fast. We're bleeding it. Emily leaned forward, her voice firm but calm. Feather the left controls. Minimize input from that side. Reroute what you can to the right systems. We'll fly asymmetrical if we have to. The first officer's hands shook as he followed her instructions, his eyes darting nervously to hers. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her tone carried the same certainty she had used when guiding rookies through emergencies. Breathe, focus, do one thing at a time. He inhaled sharply, steadied himself, and continued. Behind them, the cabin intercom buzzed. A flight attendant's voice cracked with panic. Captain, passengers are... They're asking. Emily cut in sharply. Tell them we're working the problem. Tell them we have additional pilot support. Keep them calm. There was silence, then a shaky acknowledgement. The captain shot Emily a sideways glance. You take command easily. Emily's mouth twitched into the faintest shadow of a smile. Old habits die hard. Her eyes flicked to the horizon outside the cockpit window. The plane trembled, unsteady in its flight, the left wing visibly scarred from damage. Smoke trailed behind them in a thin gray ribbon. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the sky in ominous shades of orange and red. It looked beautiful in a way, but beauty meant nothing when survival hung by a thread. Emily turned back to the instruments. Airspeed's dropping too much. Keep it up. Don't let it fall below 150, or we risk losing lift. Gentle on the controls, don't fight her too hard. She's wounded, but she'll still fly. The captain's hands moved with more care now, steadied by her guidance. His breathing slowed. For the first time since the explosion, his voice held a sliver of control. Copy that. Emily felt the adrenaline surge through her veins, the same rush she had known in combat. But it wasn't panic. It was clarity. Every sense sharpened, every detail etched into focus. She wasn't Emily Dawson, the retired instructor, anymore. She was Captain Dawson again. Combat pilot, crisis manager, survivor. And yet, beneath the calm, she knew the stakes were different. In combat, she had risked her life and those of her squadron. Here, she held the lives of hundreds of strangers' families, children, people with futures that stretched far beyond this flight. The responsibility pressed against her chest like a weight. She welcomed it. Another alarm blared. The first officer cursed. Fuel imbalance left tanks bleeding faster than expected. Emily didn't miss a beat. Cross-feed from the right. Keep the weight balanced or she yaw harder than you can control. Monitor it constantly. Every pound matters. The first officer moved, sweat dripping down his temple, but his hands were steadier now. Her words anchored him, gave him something solid to hold on to. Minutes passed like hours. The cockpit was a storm of noise, warning lights, and urgent commands. And through it all, Emily's voice cut steady, calm, precise. She was the axis around which the chaos turned. Behind the door, the cabin waited, passengers clutching hope as tightly as they clutched their armrests. They didn't know her name, didn't know her history. All they knew was that someone from row 11 had walked forward when no one else had. Emily focused on the task, but she could feel the weight of that cabin pressing on her shoulders. She didn't resent it. She carried it like she had carried her squadron like a duty. At one point, the captain's voice broke slightly as he muttered, "I thought I was going to lose them. All of them." Emily's gaze stayed on the instruments, but her tone was steel. "Not on my watch." And with those words, the cockpit seemed to breathe again. The cockpit felt like a furnace, both from the heat of overworked systems and the sheer intensity of the moment. Warning chimes sang their dreadful chorus, and every instrument panel seemed to bleed red or amber. The overhead panel blinked like a restless city skyline, each light signaling some piece of machinery failing or already gone. Emily Dawson inhaled deeply, centering herself. This wasn't a fighter jet, sleek and responsive. This was a wounded giant, lumbering through the sky, but the principles remained the same. Control the aircraft, manage the crisis, survive long enough to land. "Talk to me," she ordered, leaning forward between the captain and the first officer. The captain's voice cracked as he read from the panel. "Hydraulics still bleeding. Out. Engine 2 firelight hasn't cleared. We're compensating with right systems, but controls are heavy, sluggish. Trims unresponsive. We've declared emergency with a TC Lincoln Regional is preparing for us." Emily nodded, her combat instincts cataloging every variable. She pointed to the glowing hydraulic panel. "Okay, isolate the leak. Shut off the damaged line, reroute pressure through the secondary. You'll lose finesse, but it'll buy us time." The first officer scrambled to obey, his fingers flying over switches. For a moment, the alarms shrieked louder as the system adjusted, then quieted slightly. The controls steadied, still heavy, but more responsive. "That's better," the captain breathed. His shoulders eased an inch. Emily wasn't satisfied yet. Engine 2, give me a status. Temp spiking. Fire suppression model discharged. But lights still on. Could be a sensor fault. Could be real. Emily narrowed her eyes. In combat, she'd learned never to dismiss a warning. Sensors could lie, but fire rarely did. Assume it's real. Shut down feed to engine 2 completely. No fuel, no spark. Keep her cold. She's dead weight now. The captain hesitated, his hands hovering over the switches. Shutting down an engine midder was a decision that went against every instinct of a commercial pilot. But Emily's voice left no room for doubt. He flipped the controls. The engine. Indicators dropped, confirming the shutdown. The plane lurched slightly, adjusting to the asymmetric thrust. Emily gripped the armrest of the jump seat, steadying herself. Compensate with rudder trim. Gentle corrections. Don't fight her too hard, or you'll over-torque. The first officer applied careful input. The aircraft groaned, but it steadied. For a few seconds, the cockpit filled only with the hum of strained machinery and the steady voices of air traffic control crackling through the headset. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears, but her outward calm didn't break. The captain finally turned, studying her. You've done this before. Emily allowed herself a dry chuckle. Not in a Boeing, but physics is physics. The first officer gave her a sidelong glance. Air Force? She nodded once. Combat pilot. Iraq, Afghanistan. Flew F-16s. Lost hydraulics over Baghdad once. Landed with nothing but throttle and prayer. The captain exhaled slowly, his expression shifting from panic to something closer to respect. Then thank God you were in row 11. Emily ignored the sentiment. Gratitude could wait. Right now, survival demanded every ounce of focus. She scanned the flight displays again. What's our altitude? 24,000. Descending. Good. Controlled descent. Keep it steady. Target 12,000 before final approach. Lower means more breathable air if pressurization fails, and more margin for glide if we lose thrust. The captain adjusted accordingly, his movements smoother now, steadier under her direction. Emily leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving the instruments. Memories flooded her mind, not of combat, but of the young pilots she had trained after retiring. She'd always told them emergencies weren't about skill alone. They were about mindset. Panic killed faster than fire. Calm saved lives. Now, those words echoed back to her, and she embodied them with every breath. The intercom buzzed again. Cockpit. This is lead flight attendant. Passengers are restless. They want information. Emily grabbed the handset before the captain could. This is Dawson. I'm assisting the flight crew. Tell them the aircraft is under control. Emergency services are standing by. They need to stay calm, buckled, and trust us. A pause. Then the faint sound of relief in the attendant's reply. Copy. I'll tell them. When she set the handset back, the captain gave her a look of gratitude. You really are taking. Command, not command, she corrected, her voice cool. Support. You fly. I keep you alive. A sudden jolt rattled the cabin, throwing the first officer's clipboard to the floor. The warning panel screamed again fuel imbalance. Emily's heart kicked harder, but her voice stayed level. Cross feed. Keep the tanks balanced or she. Yaw uncontrollably. The first officer bent low, flipping switches with trembling hands. The imbalance corrected slowly, the yaw easing. He slumped back, sweat soaking his collar. Emily leaned toward him, her voice quiet but firm. You're doing fine. Breathe, one system at a time. He nodded quickly, his breathing steadier. The captain glanced at her again, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. You ever think you'd be here? Back in it? Emily's lips tightened. No, I walked away from this life years ago. But when the sky calls, she shrugged faintly. You answer. Silence settled for a moment, filled only by the steady descent and the occasional squawk from ATC. Outside, the horizon stretched, wide, painted in streaks of crimson and gold by the sinking sun. The beauty was lost on them all. Emily's mind raced ahead. Lincoln Regional wasn't built for emergencies of this scale. The runway length was borderline, emergency crews under-equipped. She knew they'd have to make every decision count. Runway length at Lincoln? She asked. The first officer answered. 7,000 feet. Emily pursed her lips. Tight, but doable. We'll need full flaps, max braking, reverse thrust from engine one only. Wait still heavy dump fuel, if possible. The captain hesitated. We're over residential areas. Dumping could. Emily cut him off. Lives down there matter, yes. But if we're too heavy, we don't stop. Choose the lesser risk. His jaw clenched. And he nodded. Grim. Dumping fuel. The hiss of valves filled the cockpit as thousands of pounds of kerosene vented into the fading sky. Emily watched the gauges drop, tension curling tighter in her chest. Minutes stretched. Each mile toward Lincoln Regional felt endless. Emily's focus never wavered, her voice steady as she guided corrections, monitored fuel, balanced hydraulics. She wasn't flying the jet herself, but she was its lifeline, the anchor pulling it toward survival. And deep inside, she knew, this was only the beginning. The descent was controlled for now, but the landing would be the true crucible. A crippled aircraft, a short runway, a cabin full of souls counting on her. Emily flexed her fingers against the armrest as if preparing them for the controls. She whispered to herself, a mantra from her combat days. Fly the plane. Always fly the plane. The captain glanced back at her, hearing the words. His eyes steadied. He nodded once, as if borrowing her mantra. Together, they pressed forward into the dying light, toward Lincoln, toward the test that would define every life on board. The horizon tilted slightly as the crippled jet began its controlled descent. The golden light of sunset painted the world below in copper and crimson, but inside the cockpit, beauty had no place. Only numbers, gauges, and survival mattered. Emily Dawson leaned forward in the jump seat, eyes locked on the instruments. Every flicker of a needle, every warning chime, every groan from the fuselage carried meaning. Her combat instincts filed the information into neat compartments. Threats. To address now, threats that could wait, and threats that were simply inevitable. Altitude 15,000, the first officer announced, his voice tight but steadier than it had been. Good, Emily said calmly. Keep her nose level, smooth descent. Don't fight the controls, guide them. Let her glide as much as she wants. The captain's hands trembled slightly on the yoke. Emily noticed and spoke more firmly, like she would to a rookie pilot. You're not wrestling a machine, you're coaxing her. Respect her wounds, and she'll carry us home. The words settled over him. His grip loosened a fraction, his shoulders easing. The plane responded better. Outside the cockpit, Lincoln Regional's runway was still invisible, hidden by distance and haze. The radios crackled with a TC's updates. Flight 327, you are priority 1. Weather clear. Winds calm. Emergency crews are staged. Runway 7 is yours. The captain replied shakily, Copy. ATC. Flight 327 cleared for priority approach. Runway 7. Emily cut in before he could sign off. Request maximum ground support on landing fire, medical foam trucks, everything they've got. The controller's voice returned, firm and professional. Understood, Flight 327. All resources. Deployed. Emily exhaled. That was one less variable to fight. The first officer adjusted the trim again, grimacing. Hydraulics worsening. Controls feel sluggish. Emily nodded, her mind racing. Okay, anticipate lag. If you want. The nose up, start the input a second early. Don't chase the reaction predicted. He swallowed hard, but followed her instructions. The aircraft dipped, then steadied, exactly as she predicted. His eyes flicked to her, relief shining in them. The intercom buzzed again, the lead flight. Attendant's voice tight with nerves. Cockpit. Passengers are asking how much longer. Emily took the handset. Tell them 20 minutes. Tell them emergency crews are ready. Most important, tell them we are in control. Repeat that until they believe it. A pause. Then, copy. When she set the handset back, the captain gave her a sideways glance. You keep them calm as well as us. Emily's mouth curved into the faintest smile. A good pilot flies the plane. A great one flies the people. Another jolt rattled the cockpit, and a low rumble shuddered through the fuselage. Warning. Light screamed. Fuel imbalance again. Emily snapped to it. Cross feed, right to left. Keep tanks balanced. We can't afford asymmetric weight this low. The first officer worked quickly, sweat dripping from his temple, but this time his hands didn't shake. Emily's confidence had steadied him, given him a rhythm to follow. Altitude 10,000, he announced. Good. Reduce descent rate. Start thinking about final approach configuration. Emily's voice was steady, crisp. Inside her, heart pounded like a war drum, but she let none of it show. The captain adjusted carefully. Speed's bleeding too much. Struggling to hold 150. Emily leaned forward. Don't let her dip below 145. That's the stall. Threshold in this configuration. She stalls, we don't recover. Manage throttle. Keep her steady. The captain's jaw clenched, sweat beading at his hairline, but he followed. The engines groaned, and the plane steadied once more. Emily's gaze flicked to the horizon. Faint glimmer appeared far ahead, the thin gray strip of Lincoln Regional's runway, still miles away, but now real, tangible. Her chest tightened. Salvation was in sight, but survival wasn't guaranteed yet. The radios crackled again. Flight 327. You are 50 miles out. Winds calm. Clear to continue descent. The captain acknowledged. Emily kept her eyes locked on the instruments. Okay, here's the plan. We come in shallow, long final. No steep turns, no sudden changes, she won't handle them. We keep speed stable, angle stable. Flaps at 20 on approach. Not full less lift, but less risk of losing control. One engine reverse thrust on touchdown. Full brakes, spoilers. Got it? Both men nodded, their eyes fixed on her like cadets before an instructor. Say it back, she demanded. The captain repeated the sequence. Shallow approach, flaps 20, speed stable, one engine reverse, max braking, spoilers deployed. Emily gave a curt nod. Good. Say it until it's muscle memory. No room for doubt. The first officer muttered it under his breath, like a mantra. The rhythm of the words seemed to steady him, and even the captain looked firmer now. The plane dipped again, turbulence shaking it like a toy. Gasps echoed faintly from the cabin beyond the locked cockpit door. Emily closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, centering herself. She remembered flying low over hostile terrain, surface-to-air missiles hunting her, alarms screaming in her ears. She remembered surviving by trusting her training, her instincts, and her crew. Fly the plane, she whispered, almost to herself. The captain glanced at her, hearing it. His lips tightened. Then he repeated softly, fly the plane. The words filled the cockpit like a shield. Altitude 8,000, the first officer announced. Emily nodded. We're in the corridor now. Visual on the runway? The captain squinted. Not yet. Hold her steady. It'll show. Soon enough. The moments dragged, the cockpit buzzing with alarms, radios, and the constant adjustments of survival. But beneath it all, a strange calm settled over Emily. Fear was there, yes, but layered under a deeper clarity. She wasn't in row 11 anymore. She wasn't just a passenger. She was where she belonged, in the fight, at the edge of disaster, guiding souls through the storm. At last, the captain exhaled sharply. Runway in sight. Emily leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the thin line of asphalt glowing under floodlights. In the distance, relief surged, but she clamped it down. Seeing the runway wasn't landing on it. The hardest part still loomed. She straightened in her seat, voice firm, commanding. All right, gentlemen, this is it. One shot, one chance. Every move from here has to be clean. No mistakes. Both men nodded, their faces pale but resolute. Emily's heart pounded, but her voice never wavered. Let's bring her home. The thin strip of Lincoln Regional's runway stretched ahead, bathed in the fading light of evening, flanked by emergency vehicles already positioned and ready. Outside the cockpit, the damaged left wing groaned with every gust of wind, a wounded animal bending beneath invisible forces. Emily Dawson's eyes never left the instruments. Every flicker of a needle, every groan of metal, every rumble of the engine, catalogued in her mind with deadly precision. Altitude 2000, the first officer said, voice steady but tense. Emily nodded. Good. Shallow approach, flaps 20. Maintain 150. Remember asymmetrical weight. Minor corrections only. The captain followed her guidance, his hands on the yoke, sweat dripping down his temples. For the first time in hours, the cabin beyond the cockpit was silent, all passengers tense and bracing. Emily leaned forward, scanning the runway visually now, confirming alignment and distance. Emergency lights from fire trucks and ambulances reflected off the fuselage, tiny signals of salvation. But the runway was short, the jet heavy, and the damaged engine reduced her margin for error to nearly zero. One miscalculation, one hesitation, and the landing would turn catastrophic. The left wing shuddered again, a low metallic groan echoing through the fuselage. Emily's pulse quickened, not with fear, but anticipation. Every muscle in her body coiled to respond. She leaned close to the first officer. Steady. Trust your inputs. Small, precise. Don't fight her, guide her. She's hurt, not broken. He nodded. Understood. Captain, Emily said firmly, line up visually. Keep her straight. One chance, one shot. The runway lights grew larger. Emily watched the altimeter like a hawk. 1,000 feet start flare sequence. Prepare for landing. The plane dipped, a slight dip from the uneven thrust, then stabilized. She could hear the faint tremor of tires against the runway's approach lights already through the cabin, a subtle vibration that promised the end was near. Flaps full, Emily commanded. Gear down. The captain hesitated. Flaps full? Yes. You'll need maximum lift and slower speed to stabilize her on approach. The first officer toggled the landing gear down, and a low metallic clunk reverberated through the cockpit. Lights confirmed the wheels locked. Emily's jaw tightened. Every moment counted. Altitude 500, the first officer reported. Steady? Speed? 150. Holding. Emily's heart thudded, but her breathing remained calm. She focused on timing, throttle, and alignment, as if guiding a bird wounded but capable of flight. She could feel the tug of gravity, the wind's slight veer, and the uneven pull of the surviving engine. The runway grew longer, more real, and so did the tension. Behind them, the passengers clutched hands, closed eyes, and whispered prayers. Emily didn't think of them. She thought of physics, angles, forces calculations, happening faster than thought, faster than fear. 200 feet, the first officer called out. Flare, smooth, no sudden inputs, Emily instructed. The plane leveled slightly, almost gliding. She felt the aircraft quiver beneath her, the strained fuselage trying to bend, to resist, but she held her calm. The tires kissed the tarmac with a jolt, a vibration that shook the entire cabin. Emily's teeth clenched. She leaned into the controls mentally, envisioning every micro-adjustment. The jet skidded slightly on the uneven weight, but she guided the throttles, the rudder, and the brakes with precise, gentle commands. Reverse thrust on engine 1, she said. Full braking, spoilers deploy. The plane groaned but obeyed, decelerating with a controlled urgency. Sparks flew faintly from the tires, smoke rising from the friction, yet the aircraft remained obedient. The captain exhaled audibly, the tension draining from his shoulders fractionally. We're holding her. Emily's eyes never left the instruments. Maintain. Don't relax yet. The runway lights blurred past the windows, growing longer as the aircraft slowed. The emergency vehicles flanking the strip were now close enough to see, their crews tense but ready. Every second counted. Passengers gripped their seats, some screaming in relief, some sobbing uncontrollably. Emily felt none of it directly, yet she could sense the shift, the gradual collective exhale of hundreds of lives hanging in the balance. The plane shuddered again as the nose wheel touched down, bouncing slightly on the uneven tarmac. Emily's hands gripped the armrest of the jump seat, her voice calm but commanding. Steady. Rudder corrections only. Keep her straight. The brakes engaged fully. The engine whined, struggling to hold against the mass of the aircraft. Sparks and smoke from the tires streaked beneath the fuselage. The jet skidded, wobbling slightly as asymmetrical thrust tugged left, but Emily anticipated it. Rudder right. Steady, steady. Gradually the trembling slowed. The plane's speed decreased, controlled, deliberate. The final stretch of runway approached. Emily's heart raced with measured adrenaline. Every microsecond, every calculation mattered. Engage spoilers fully. Keep her balanced. The aircraft finally slowed enough for the captain to ease the rudder. The jet groaned once, then settled fully onto the tarmac. Tires screeched, smoke billowing in thin columns, but Flight 327 had survived. The engines idled, alarms silenced, and the once shrieking cockpit fell quiet. Emily exhaled finally, her hands loosening from the jump seat. Around her, the captain and first officers stared at the runway ahead, exhausted but alive. She leaned, back slightly, chest heaving, adrenaline still coursing. She allowed herself a fleeting glance toward the cabin door, imagining the passengers, imagining the relief, imagining the lives spared because someone in row 11 had answered the call. The captain turned toward her, voice hoarse but tinged with awe. I don't know what to say. You saved them. Saved all of them. Emily shook her head. We did it together. You flew the plane. I guided. Emergency crews surged around the plane, attaching chocks, inspecting wings, guiding passengers safely. The passengers erupted into applause, tears, and relieved laughter. Emily felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones' exhaustion, mixed with quiet triumph. The mother and child from row 12 stepped down first, the boy clinging to Emily's outstretched hand briefly. Thank you, he whispered, eyes wide. Emily gave him a small smile. Stay safe. The media would call it a miracle. Aviation experts would study every panel, every decision. But for Emily, it was simply another mission completed. She had answered the call when chaos erupted, and the lives of strangers had depended on her skill, focus, and calm. As the passengers exited, hugging one another, some weeping, some laughing, Emily finally allowed herself to breathe fully. She stepped out onto the tarmac, the cool night air brushing against her face, carrying away the tension that had held her body taut for hours. For a moment, she closed her eyes, feeling the reality of survival. She had left row 11, stepped into the cockpit, and answered a call few could have met. Lives had been saved because she refused to remain passive. And for the first time in years, Emily Dawson allowed herself to feel pride, not for accolades, not for medals, but for doing what she had always been trained to do: lead, act, survive, and protect. The crowd of passengers and emergency crews clapped and cheered, but Emily only nodded quietly, the weight of her service settling in. This was her life's work in miniature: a single flight, hundreds of lives, and one woman answering the call from row 11. The sun had set, leaving only the glow of runway lights. And in that glow, Emily felt something rare: peace.